everybody, welcome back to Chandler's Bitchin' Kitchen. And as I just mentioned, today we're going to be making bread. Now, not 100% whole wheat bread, not your store-bought Dempster's, more like dumpsters, bag bread. We're going to make bread with a soul. And it's not even that hard. And I really want you to try it. There's no better time than now. Not only is this homemade bread, it's no-knead bread, which is to say that you don't have to put in, a good 15 minutes of manual labor to get a delicious result at the end. I'm going to break this down in a few sections here. We're going to start with a quick rundown of the ingredients list. You saw it in quick motion there in the intro video, but to give you a more detailed breakdown of what's in it, first of all, by volume, 3 cups all-purpose flour. You can also use bread flour, which just contains more protein. It doesn't make a huge difference with this loaf. 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, either active dry or instant. I'm not going to go into what the differences are between those here because it's not terribly relevant. You can look that up online. 1 teaspoon of salt. We'll talk about that in a second. 1.5 cups of hot H2O. That's dihydrogen monoxide. It comes out of your tap. You can also buy it in bottles if you're that kind of person. Now, since you're going to all the trouble of making bread, why not make a bunch of bread? It's not significantly more effort, and you can always freeze the second half or give it away. What better time to meet a neighbor or, I don't know, save it for yourself. Just save it for yourself. Never mind. Now, since you're going to make double, you got to double it. And because this is baking, it's more of a science than regular cooking. You do need to be accurate. And while I'm trying to convince you that this is easy, baking does require more accurate measurements than just about any other kind of cooking. In fact, unless you want to get into like candy making and like advanced pastry stuff, but I am not one of those people, so we switch to the metric system here. So where these cup and teaspoon measures, these are measurements of volume. You need to be sure you're using a dry measure versus a wet measure or a liquid measure. When you, with dry things like flour, yeast, and salt, that's more of a concern because their density can change depending on how you scoop flour. And I'll do a quick demo of that in a minute. But in terms of water, you can always just measure that by volume because our entire system is based on the volume and mass of water being the same. That is, 1 milliliter of water equals 1 gram of water. I'm not going to demonstrate that. You probably got that in high school science class, and we're going to move on. So when we switch over to grams, we gain a higher degree of accuracy, and we guarantee some better results for ourselves too. So I recommend you do it. Now, for something like yeast, you don't have to worry too much about volume versus weight measures because it doesn't compress like flour does. And it generally only comes in these little pellets. Sometimes you'll see it in kind of flakes or in, it looks almost like tiny sprinkles. And sometimes you can buy it in a cake. So you know what? I take that back. Weigh it. Just weigh it. You're only weighing 2 grams anyway. It doesn't make all that much difference in any case. Then we get on to salt. Salt is crucial in baking. They say salt, well, it gives everything its flavor. It makes it taste more like itself. Some people, I mentioned in the last video, are weak and like to avoid salt, but it's a crucial part of several important biological processes in our body and, contributes more than you can imagine to your overall health, as long as you don't overdo it. So just don't go crazy. It's 12 grams. That's not a lot. Especially when you consider that you're going to eat this bread over the course of, hopefully, a few days. More likely, a few hours. But anyway, I digress. That's all of your ingredients, the so-called software. Let's talk briefly about hardware, the kinds of things you're going to need to put this together. First of all, I like a big stainless steel mixing bowl. Rubberized bottom is nice because it hugs the countertop while I'm mixing things. And then when I'm measuring all my stuff, I have to use an electric scale, or an electronic scale, more accurately. This one is a No-Knead. I bought it in the Fatherland, Germany, when I was over there. And I like it because it has a big screen and this charming fake bamboo motif. But over here, the Danes cook, not to be confused with Dane cook. Actually, this is a really great opportunity. Where's my Sharpie? Use old Dane cook here. He's good because he's got these nice tactile buttons. They make good clicky sounds. Very satisfying, and you know when you've hit it. The issue with this one here is these buttons are capacitive. They just trigger based on your touch, and that seems futuristic, but when you're weighing stuff out and you want to tare it, that is to reset the weight to 0 and then add some more, you really want to know that you actually touch the button. Where here, not only is the tear button hardware, but it's combined with the on button. Super, real good. Top notch, Dane Cook. We're going to use you, despite your industrial stainless steel exterior. We see beyond that. All right, so you see, you hold that, and eventually that'll turn off. Okay, goodbye, Germany. Hello, China. Figures. So when we measure, we need a little measuring bowl. I'm going to use this for my salt and my yeast. So if you've never operated a digital scale before, this is how it works. Before you even turn it on, put your measuring container on top and hit on. And that should start it at 0. And good, it's already set for grams. That's what we're talking about here. So I'm going to measure in my yeast. I want a 1/4 teaspoon per batch, and because I'm doubling it, I'm going to do twice that. And you see, it doesn't even register. 1 to 2 grams. I mean, 1 gram is the smallest unit on this scale, so of course the accuracy is going to vary a little bit. I'm all right with that. 2 teaspoons of yeast. 2 1/4 teaspoons or a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast is ample for this recipe. Oh, look at that. Now it's 0. See? 0. Anyway, we're going to tear that. Into that, we're going to add our 2 teaspoons salt. Now, I mentioned earlier, dry measures are a little bit complicated because this, you may notice, is kosher salt. It's got a big grain to it. It's big pieces, as opposed to, say, true granulated, free-flowing table salt, which has these itty-bitty little granules. Now, you can fit a lot more of these little tiny guys into a teaspoon than you can with these big chunky guys. So you gotta weigh it. So we're gonna weigh it. I'm gonna use the kosher because I like it, and it's available here right on my countertop. I can just scoop into it. So what do I want? I want 12 grams total in my doubled recipe. So we're just gonna use the 1 tablespoon. Also, a little trick I like to do with dry measures, specifically with salt, but anything else that you need a teaspoon of. A teaspoon is a good measure, and you can fit in the palm of your hand. So just in case you're ever cooking out in the woods or something and you need measuring spoons and you don't have them, practice while you have the opportunity to put that amount in the palm of your hand and see what it looks like. See how much it piles up in there. There's a teaspoon. And now I can use that in the future as kind of a rough guess. It doesn't matter. Salt's great. Get over it. What is 1 teaspoon going to weigh? 5 grams. So you see, this stuff isn't as dense in the scoop as would be the free-flowing table salt. So I'm going to keep going here until we get to 12. 11, 12. Done. Goodbye. Sodium chloride. Now, as for, I kind of got sidetracked there. I wanted to talk about everything we're going to need. Once you've got all your stuff measured, I'm going to use this again to measure my flour later. So, to be continued on the scale. You're also going to need a whisk. Don't forget to pronounce the H. Crucial for incorporating dry ingredients together, making sure they're all mixed and evenly distributed in the big old bowl before you add your water. You don't want to get a clump of yeast over here and a clump of salt over there and mix the whole thing up. You end up with these weird concentrations throughout the dough. Things don't end up as nice. So once we have everything together, I'm going to hit it with the whisk to combine. Once it's in the bowl with the water, the old silicone spatula. This one's great. You can see it's got a few witness marks here from previous scrapings. This one's gone into a Cuisinart a couple of times, I think. I really like this one. I've been using it for a long time, as you can tell from the wear and tear. The only downside with this one is the handle is made of this really brittle, looks like polycarbonate. It does melt if you leave it on the edge of a pot. Also, eventually, this spot right here, which is notoriously difficult to keep clean, that's where your stress is going to concentrate. When you're really reefing on this thing in the bowl, eventually this is going to snap off and you're going to be left with a useless handle and a piece of silicone at the end. Silicone, not silicon. There's a difference. Moving on. As far as cooking vessels go, we're going to use two approaches here to get two different final form factors. This here is the Dutch oven. I forget who makes this one. This is Wolfgang Puck, Chef Puck. I got this, I don't know how long ago, but you can see it's had some life. It's seen a few things, you know? These things are great. It's cast iron body with an enamel in it. That makes it relatively non-stick and less likely to corrode. Now this edge up here is unfinished, so you don't want to leave that wet. Well, if you're ever washing it, like don't leave it face down in a wet thing, because this whole ring here will rust. Same thing with the edge of the lid itself. And it's good to have a metal handle on it, because this is going to go into a 450 Fahrenheit oven, and plastic melts in that kind of a temperature range. So get yourself a good metal one. These are great. Cast iron is great for retaining heat. Once you charge it up with heat like we're going to do, it becomes like a thermal battery that's just ready to dump its heat into whatever you put into it, which in our case will be bread dough. So, cast iron, Dutch oven, enameled if possible, but not necessarily. That's great. Ooh, also, another important point about the Dutch oven. In big professional bakeries, they've got these special ovens that inject water into the cavity of the oven while it's on, and that generates a ton of steam, and that's gonna it's gonna keep the outside of the bread moist. Ugh, there it is. I knew I was gonna have to say it eventually. It keeps the outside of the bread moist, which means you don't get a hard shell on the outside. So as the bread grows up, that is, the air bubbles inside the bread are expanding due to the heat, then the surface of the bread can bloom outwards. If you let your bread dry before it goes in to the oven, it's going to form this kind of a shell on the outside. It's not even a crust. It's like leaving pudding out. You get a skin on the outside, and that becomes kind of hard. And then when everything starts heating up in the oven, the bread blooms out, and then boom, you got a blowout, and the soft dough on the inside shoots out through wherever the crack in the skin is. Things look hideous. You don't want that. So, long story short, or I should say long story long, by using a Dutch oven, you can contain the moisture that's already in the bread dough inside the cooking vessel, which means you create effectively a pro oven inside your own, you know, home chef oven. Residential grade. That's enough about the Dutch oven. Jeez, we could go on forever. This here is a loaf pan. It's covered in a nice Teflon coating, which probably shouldn't go up to the temperatures I'm going to be doing, but I've been using it that way for a while, and haven't had any issues yet, as far as I know. I mean, no extra fingers. I do have a splitting headache whenever I make this bread, though. Maybe that's it. Anyway, moving on. I'm going to make one loaf in the Dutch oven and one in this little guy here. Now, on the inside of the Dutch oven and the loaf pan, I'm going to use parchment paper. This stuff is great. This is the only thing I worry that you might not have at home. And if you don't, just go out and get some. It's worth it. I know the stores are a little crazy right now, but there should be plenty of this stuff lying around. It's paper that's been impregnated with, you guessed it, our friend, silicone. Yeah, not silicon, silicone. And it can generally survive pretty good temperatures. I'm taking it up to 450, as I mentioned, but this stuff says it's only rated to 420. So we're just going to make a little field markup. We'll ask the on-site inspector if it's okay if we bend the rules just this once. I think we're going to get away with it. I know the guy. I drink beers with him all the time. What else do we got? When we're shaping the dough, I like to use a bench scraper. This one's great. It costs about $1 US, which used to be like $1.70 Canadian. But it's nice flexible plastic. It's got a straight edge for scraping cutting boards and counters, and it's got the curved edge for getting good into the recesses of the bowl, help you scrape stuff out. It's great, and it's cheap, and it'll last forever. Now this one here, you can use this one for cutting a lot more than you can the plastic, and it's got a nice ergonomic handle on it, but you can't get into your corners with this. I mean, you could try one of these rounded edges here, but it doesn't conform to the edge of your bowl, so it's not as good. And of course, who could forget? A workhorse of any baker's kitchen, the bread knife. The serrated bread knife allows you to take tiny little bites out of the bread as you saw down. You never really like crush down into the bread with a knife like this. You just go back and forth like a reciprocating saw and cut your way through. It's the only tool for the job. A regular kitchen knife isn't gonna cut it here. So get yourself one. It's worth it. That's all of our tools, I hope. Now, as far as the software, our ingredients, as I already mentioned, we've got the flour. I'm using all-purpose. I'm going to use a little bit. I'm going to probably do 1/5 of this mass in whole wheat because it adds a certain, I don't know, nutty intrigue to an otherwise boring loaf. Also, because I can't help myself and I can't leave well enough alone, I'm going to add in some mix-ins like these dehydrated onion flakes, which are going to come back to life nicely while the dough rests. And for some color and a little texture, some roasted black sesame seed. Iri kuru goma. Okay, here's how to measure flour if you don't have a scale. I'm going to quickly demonstrate why it matters what approach you take. Here is a simple 1 cup dry measure. I've got my digital scale, Dane Cook. I've got my giant bowl. I just realized that you will not be able to see what this measures because the bowl is so big. So perhaps we'll use a smaller bowl. That's the idea. That's the ticket. Innovate on the fly. Adapt and overcome. Little bowl. There we go. Now you can see, right? So, like I said before, you put your measurement vessel on top of your scale before you turn it on. That way it accounts for the weight of the vessel. Now, white flour can be tricky because if I go straight into the bag right off the counter, and I scoop into it, and I'm pressing against the side of the bag, I'm not really thinking about what I'm doing. I'm going to level it off, make sure it's full, level it off with the back of the knife. Sure, there's a big void in there, but watch this. This is going to be pretty dang obvious to you. A nice sphere of flour in there. 178 grams. If I do nothing special, I just get right in there, whole hog, go to town. 178. Don't forget that. 178. 178. Now, just pouring that flour back into the bowl or into the bag will have aerated it somewhat and added some air into the mix, which is going to show you. Okay, so we're back to 0, even though there are some grains of flour left in there, no big deal. Oh, yeah, sure enough, right on cue. Okay, so now if I stir my knife in here, and get under the flour, just sort of spread it around a bit. 178, 178, don't forget the number. It's a good thing there's nobody here to screw with me. Okay, you scoop in, similar to before. Try to avoid pressing against the side of the bag. Just scoop in to that area you just shook up with the knife. Scrape it off. Here we go. And it reads 156, a full 20 grams less. You might think less is less, right? Well, I want as much flour as I can possibly get in there. Well, not if you're measuring by weight. A cup can vary a lot. And if you're not instructed on how to fill a dry cup measure, your results not only may vary, they will vary. And you're going to get frustrated and you're never going to bake again. And you're just going to go back to the store and buy the dumpsters. And I don't want that for you. I want you to make bread. It's very satisfying. Stay with me. So, if that's 155, put my big old bowl back on the top here. We're going to keep going. We're going to tare it again. So that's 155. I need, according to my handy card, 720. So I'm just going to add this manually and keep checking because the scale does update kind of slowly. I think I'm going to finish off this bag, so that goes in. Okay, so there's 542. And I'm going to add a little bit more white to this. And I think I'm going to go with maybe 100. I'll make the last 100 whole wheat. New bag of flour. Bread making is becoming really, really popular here in the apocalypse, and everyone's going back to their roots. Bread making at home. Okay, so we're going to get this up to 620. 620. Okay, now the final 100. Across the finish line with the whole wheat. Like I said, this gives you a nice additional texture, a little extra flavor, and you get a little bit of moral license because you're not just having the unhealthy high glycemic carbs, you're going to get some nice slower digesting low glycemic carbs here as well. So in she goes. You don't want to use too much whole wheat in a loaf because it has a tendency to reduce the amount of leavening, how much lift you get out of a loaf. And the reason that is because when you make bread, you're developing a network of proteins called gluten. And when you develop gluten, what happens later is the yeast starts eating the starches in the flour, and it starts burping and farting carbon dioxide, and the gluten is the network that catches those air bubbles and allows your whole loaf to bloom and grow. And when you add whole wheat to the mix, what makes whole wheat is the addition of the ground up husk on the outside of the wheat. That's where the color is coming from. And those little bits of wheat husk act as little razor blades, and they cut up the gluten network, making it less able to collect air and to trap it while the rise is going on. As a result, you end up with a denser loaf. That's why I try to keep my ratio of whole wheat to white relatively low. So I think if I go with 100, I'm not going to do the math. I know this will work. Okay, that's out there. Now, as before, I have my yeast and my salt. Let me get the scale out of here. Goodbye, Dane. Good job. And shake this out. Now I'm going to shake. Senora. Shake it all the time. Okay. Whisk. To combine. Distribute ingredients thusly. Stir for a while. There's a lot more flour in there than there is anything else. And the longer you stir, the more likely you're going to get an even mix later. Okay. The whisking is done. The dry ingredients have been added. Now we need 758 milliliters of hot water. Hot because this is fast no-knead bread, and a little extra heat is going to help the biological processes of the yeast go just a little bit faster. Sometimes if you're letting a loaf of bread rise, you'll do it in an oven with the light on and the heat off, and that generates kind of a warm environment for your bread to rise and for the yeast to get going. But if you add hot water to the mix, you kind of kickstart that whole process. And by having a little extra energy in the mix, things will go a little bit faster, which takes this loaf from requiring an overnight rest in the fridge to only 3 hours in a nice warm place. Yes, you heard me right. You're going to be waiting at least 3 hours for your bread. I know it's easier to go to the grocery store and just buy the Dempsters, but don't do it. Trust me, stick with me. I'm also going to add in some of my mix-ins right now, because when they get wet, they're going to, like the onion is going to bloom and rehydrate a little bit. I feel like I've said bloom a lot. It's going to rehydrate. It's not going to bloom. It's not a flower. It's not a fungus. Anyway. I just like to cover the top. Maybe a little more. Can't hurt. A little extra intrigue for the person who's eating it, which in this case is probably just going to be me. And then some black sesame seeds, because those add a little bit of interest as well. Okay, got the dry. I'm going to mix that in too. Should have just added it earlier, because there's no benefit to this at all. You cannot do any damage to the bread until it's wet. And even then, it's pretty tough. I mean, we're not making muffins or a cake or something here. When you mix things, you develop gluten in the presence of water. That's true whether you're making bread, cake, brownies, anything with flour in it. You're developing gluten whenever you mix it in the presence of water. And so with bread, we want to. This is called no-knead bread, however, because in a traditional bread recipe, you would have to really reef on it for about 15 minutes, or unless you have like an expensive KitchenAid stand mixer. But this one, it mixes itself. During that 3-hour rise, the yeast is going to bubble up through the entire mixture, and it's going to effectively generate the gluten for us. You end up with a pretty wet dough, but it's just great because you don't have to do much to it at all. Let's get moving. Gonna get 3 cups hot water. I'm okay with measuring water using volume because, as I said, 1 milliliter of water is 1 gram of water, so I'm just gonna go by volume here. So 2 cups. It says hot water. Hot, just the hottest that you can get out of the tap. Yeast starts to die at around 120 Fahrenheit, and by 140, it's all dead. So you don't want it that hot, but odds are you're not getting water that's that hot out of your tap anyway. Mine tops out at about 116 Fahrenheit. So we should do 2 cups-ish. Also, as far as baking recipes go, this one is very, very resilient to mistakes. It's hard to screw it up. The exact ratios don't matter as much as if you're making a cake. You want to have a special texture and that sort of thing. You need a certain amount of rise on some cakes. With the bread, it's really going to take care of itself. So don't stress it. Just try to hit your marks as closely as you can. But don't lose any sleep. Now, when the time comes to measure or to mix in the water, I have a little trick I like to do. I pour from on high. This forces the water to fall further. It plunges deeper into the flour and kind of gets the mixing process started early. And then you don't have as much chasing this shaggy ball of dough around the bowl trying to get it wet. You just sort of mix it in as you go. I like to sort of circle around the exterior. It's kind of like doing a pour over coffee. But okay, so in we go. Dump it in a bit of a circle. There's 2 cups, and I need 1 more cup after this. The dead center. Now the clock is officially ticking, because once the yeast gets wet, it wakes up and it begins to come back from a state of hibernation. Actually, it's kind of morbid. Yeast is commercially sold in these little granules, and the exterior of a little ball of yeast is actually dead yeast, and the stuff that's alive is on the inside. So once the exterior gets wet, it starts to break down, the real yeast creeps out and looks for its food. So away we go. All we have to do is mix to combine. So This is where this silicone spatula here is great. Lets you scrape the sides, get under it, push it in, go, go, go. This is the most work you'll have to do in this recipe. And I know it took us a long time to get here, but I do like to listen to myself talk. And besides, it's been lonely here working at home. Making an amateur cooking video is not a great way to keep in touch with people. Although some of you have very kindly reached out after last week's episode and said that you're glad it's back, and I appreciate your support. I hope we can keep it going. And you see that? It's super wet. If you made half a batch, it would not look this wet. I may have overdone it a bit on the water, but later you can always incorporate a little more flour when we're shaping, and that will sort of tighten it up a little bit. You know, doughs that are this wet to begin with tend to be pretty tough to maneuver and to shape later on, and you have to get into some pretty interesting techniques where you're scraping underneath and just flicking it around and minimizing the amount of contact you have with the dough, but we'll get into that later. The mixing is done. You see no dry spots anymore. It's all good and incorporated. It's got a lovely smell already. And all we have to do now, I'm going to turn the light on in my lower oven. And I'm going to put some cling film over top of this. My luck, it won't quite cover the top of the bowl. Yeah. Danger, danger, Will Robinson. Boys and girls and non-binaries, I have made a mistake. My initial recipe, when I doubled and did my conversions, somehow a 5 snuck in there. Simple arithmetic, but I screwed it up. This should have been a 0. So what I've gone and done is put way too much water into the mix. And this is why it was so sloppy. Even to me, I thought, wow, this is wetter than last time I made it. What do we do? How do we adjust? I'm going to leave the yeast and the salt alone because it'll all come out in the wash for those two. And the difference here is more of a structural problem than it is a flavor problem for the final product. So shaping later would be next to impossible as far as I know. So rather than risk it, I'm going to adjust it now using the power of mathematics. So in the baking game, there is what's called a baker's percentage. Don't skip ahead. Baker's percentage is the weight of an ingredient with respect to the weight of the flour. So the baker's percentage in the original recipe of water to flour was 98%, which is ridiculously high. You do not see baker's percentages this high, but hey, it's worked in the past. I'm going to keep going with it, assuming I figure out a way to fix my current mistake. So what happened in reality? Well, I added 758 grams or milliliters of water to my 720, giving me a baker's percentage of 105%. I have more water than I have flour by mass, leading to the mud muck that you saw. That will be impossible to shape later. I could use it for grout, perhaps. So what do? Well, thankfully, I do remember a few things about math. And for some final adjustments, I just need to figure out what my new total amount of flour needs to be to get my ratio back to where it was supposed to be. So if before I had the intended recipe should have 708 water to 720 of flour, which means, like I said before, 98% baker's percentage. I actually put in 758 of water, so now I need to solve for X to get my new mass of flour required overall. Solve for X, you get 774, which is a difference of 54 grams from the original amount. So I'm just gonna take my bowl out, add 54 grams to it, mix it around until well combined, and throw it back in the oven. Cool? Cool. Sorry. All right, folks. We're back. It's been about 3 hours since we pulled this thing out of the fire using the power of mathematics. Now it's time for probably the most fun in this entire process, which is shaping. And shaping just means we're going to kind of set the stage for how the bread is going to, the final form that the bread is going to take. We're going to take it from a very goopy, loose mess. I know that sounds appetizing, and we're going to give it a little bit of structure. We're not going to knead it because that would be wrong. But we're going to manhandle it a bit and get it into the shape that we need it to be in so that it can rest, it can proof, and then it'll go in the oven in about an hour. So more waiting ahead, but don't worry, there's something to do right now. So let's pull out our dough. Oh yes, looks a bit like Jabba the Hutt. Good God. So you can see the yeast has done its job. It's munching down on all those delicious starches in there and creating carbon dioxide. Delicious. It smells doughy, a little bit oniony. It's really, really wet, which is going to be interesting because shaping this is harder with a high hydration dough like this. I mean, look at it. It's like pudding. But this is really loose because it's full of air. We're going to beat the air out of it, and then we're going to get into shaping. We're going to get it into a bowl or into a loaf pan so that it can proof in the correct shape, and then we'll put it into the oven. There are a few tricks between here and there, but Scrapey McScrapeface is back here, and check out how much gluten has been developed in this dough. You see all those strings pulling away from the wall? That's the network of proteins developed in the dough. Gluten's made up of glutenin and gliadin. And if you have an intolerance or a celiac disease, this stuff will ruin your day, if not your week. So if that's you, this recipe is not for you. So I use my scraper to kind of pull everything into a single mass, pull it away from the walls. And in doing so, I aerate, or rather de-aerate, the dough a little bit. See how sticky that is? So the gluten, we've developed a fair amount just by letting the yeast do its thing. But there is still some work to be done. I'm going to work right on the top of my stove because it's easy to clean. It's very smooth. And when I'm done, I just hit it with the razor blade to scrape up all the dry dough that remains behind. But because this is so wet, I am going to hit this thing with a ton of flour, and then I'm going to start to work on it a little bit. I'm not going to knead it. This is no-knead bread. Okay. Okay, Scrapey, you're still here. I'm going to go a little crazy here because this stuff really is quite wet. Right to the edges. When you're dealing with bread making, just make peace with the fact that you're going to get flour on you, on your shirt, on your pants, whatever you're wearing. I do recommend that you wear something while you do this. Okay, here we go. Let's scrape this out of the bowl into the middle of our floured area here. Boy, it doesn't want to come out on its own. It needs some coaxing. Okay, come on. That's it. Now, I keep saying this is no-knead bread. But the fact is, a small amount of turning is required to bring this all together into a single piece that we can then cut in half and split between a couple of containers. So that's about all you really need. I'm getting most of it here. This is where it gets interesting because this dough is so sticky. It's gonna take some work to get it to do what you want. So get a little flour on Scrapey here, maybe a little on the hands too. These things are about to get sticky. We're gonna turn this over itself and fold it. Try to get to 10 and you'll see how much it comes together. So go under one edge and lift away and stretch. Oh yeah, that's really airy. The first one, and you'll feel it start to come together too the more you do this. This is de-aerating the dough, popping all the big air bubbles that are in there. See that? It's kind of gelatinous right now, but it's not the big blob anymore. It's coming together. You can see that it wants to tighten up. All the right pieces are in place for this dough to develop some gluten character. Okay, what's that, six-ish? Just keep going at it from a different angle. Stretch a bit, fold over, push down. This isn't kneading. This is way less work than kneading. Kneading, you get right in there and fold this thing over itself like 100 times, maybe more, over the course of 10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the recipe. Looks like the amount of flour we put down is appropriate. My hand's starting to get club hand here, as the term goes. Keep going. I'll go as long as it'll let me. Gotta get close to 10 there. Okay. You see it's absorbed the flour that I laid down, and it's not, so now it's starting to fight me. So, flour up a little more. Pull it over itself one more time here. And then, I really want to get my hands on this and start working on it. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to divide this directly in half, just going to eyeball it. I'm not going to weigh it out or anything. I'm going to fill this bowl, which is smaller than my other one, with parchment paper. Then I'm going to lay my dough in on top of it, or half of it. And this is going to be the ball-shaped loaf that goes in my Dutch oven. I let it proof in here while the oven preheats, and then I put the Dutch oven in the oven while it's preheating so that it can kind of charge up with heat. And then when the time comes, I drop the, I pull the bread with the parchment paper out of here, and I drop it into the Dutch oven, and we get a ton of heat right off the bat. I clamp the lid on top to get that steaming effect I was telling you about earlier. So I'm gonna hack this in half. Oh, and similarly for the loaf-shaped pan, I've got a loaf pan in standby that I'll use for the proofing, and another loaf pan that will go in the oven to preheat. So let's do it, shall we? All right, I'm gonna cut this in half-ish. Gonna tug one side over there, you over there. Oh yeah. Don't be afraid, you can't hurt it. And it can't hurt you. The side, getting under your nails. That's just part of the deal, and I promise you it is worth it. So I'm gonna move one of these blobs over here in this floury area for a second. Pile it on itself. Good. And you there, you are gonna be my ball-shaped loaf. And get that parchment paper circle ready to go. I'll lay my dough ball in there when it's ready to go, and then that's gonna go in the bowl, and I'm gonna cover it up so it can proof for another hour. So we need to shape this into approximately a ball. How are we going to make this gloopy mess into a ball? Well, as you noticed when I brought the ball of dough together the first time, it wants to take a shape. You just can't wait forever. You got to move somewhat quickly. Don't get stressed out. It's really easier than it looks. And while it looks a little messy, it cleans up in like a few seconds. So take it easy. All right, so I'm gonna move this. It's easier to show than it is to say. All right, that is super wet. So I'm gonna do a quick hit. Flour for my hands, flour for the dough, flour the stovetop, a little bit in there. Now, I'm just gonna start working on this. Let's see what we get. Get a nice clean edge on my scraper. Okay. Pull towards you, scrape the surface, turn 90 degrees. Pull towards you, turn 90 degrees. And just keep repeating that. Eventually, my surface, which was all flaws and bumps before, will sort of smooth out, and I'll end up with this kind of a dome shape. Some imperfections are nice, they give the final loaf some character, but at this stage, I want a blank canvas that I can carve a little design into or something like that. This is the challenge of working with a wet dough, is it doesn't like to hold its shape. But keep at it. Drag. It's important that the dough drags a bit against the surface because that causes the stretching action on the top. So push down and towards yourself. Down and towards yourself. So you can see it's a little bit loaf shaped here. It's kind of longer than it is wide. I'm just going to stop there for the loaf shaped one, but for the round one, I want to go a little bit further, see if I can't. See, that's just beautifully round right there. So stretch this out. The little dish malformed from the bowl. I put it in once already. There we go. Roughly circular. I like the way that looks. Now, I don't want to get dough on my parchment paper because that's going to eventually burn on the inside. So I'm going to do a quick rinse. Get the extra dough off my fingers. And then lay that right in the bowl. Grab this by the corners, drop it in. I like to smooth out as much of the edges as I can to prevent weird little angles from forming. And eventually, okay, so I'm going to cover that right now and use some of my saran from earlier. Okay. Go. That started. I'm going to put that back in the oven just to make room for my next trick. Actually, I'll spare you guys having to watch me do that mess again for the loaf-shaped one, but the same formula applies. Shape it into approximately the shape you want, drop it onto a sheet of parchment paper. In this case, because it will end up going into this pan, I'm using this funky pre-cut piece that will kind of, once it goes into the pan, the sides will fold up like so. Hopefully these little curly bits will go behind. Again, easier to show than it is to explain. I'll just do that and spare you the time. Okay, we're all cleaned up. The bread has all been pre-shaped and it's now proofing in the oven, but I need to take it out of there because I need to preheat the oven. So here's the loaf-shaped one I mentioned. I did manage to wrangle my parchment paper into position. Here's the boule, or round ball-shaped loaf. Boule is French for ball. Try not to act surprised. So these can kind of proof up here for the next half hour or so. I know I said an hour just a minute ago, but that would be too much. You'd have these giant bubbles in there, and if that's what you want, go for it. But I prefer a tighter crumb structure. That's what she said. In about 20 minutes, I'm going to start preheating my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And when I do that, I'm going to put my cast iron enameled Dutch oven in there, along with the lid to get it charging up. And I have the lid, and I have a spare loaf pan. Always buy two. It's always good to have a second one of the exact same size. You'd be amazed. So, and then I'm going to get this one heating up in there as well. So when the time comes and my oven's preheated and these are fully proofed, I'm going to lift the parchment paper out of each one, put it into its actual cooking vessel, and then it's going to cook at 450 for half an hour. At that point, I take the lid off of my Dutch oven, and I take my parchment paper out from under the bread and let it have full contact with the bottom of the pan for the final 5 to 15 minutes. For this guy, because I don't have a lid for him, I'm going to use this to kind of make a fake lid out of aluminum foil, and that way it'll just sit on top like that and trap some of the steam the same way the lid on the Dutch oven does. So I'm going to do that, and you will see them when they're just about to go into the oven, and then you'll see them again after they come out, and prepare to be amazed. This stuff is great. Stay with me. We're almost there. All right. Now, as I explained, my Dutch oven has a lid already. It's in the oven with the other baking pan right now getting hot, but I need to make my kind of fake lid for my baking pan here, my loaf pan. So, I've already screwed up because that loaf pan is in the oven. So I need to get creative. So, I get some aluminum foil here. about right. Generally better to take more than you need. Crease it here, just tear a little easier. You go. Thank you for your service. Okay. I'm going to do dull side out. The dull side absorbs more heat, which is what I want for this thing. Shiny side in. It's more reflective, so you want it on the inside. Fun fact, aluminum foil has a dull side and a shiny side because it's made in 2 rolls. And where the 2 rolls kind of come together and press against each other, that's the dull side, because they kind of smoosh together. So, how it's made, just Google it. Anyway, so we put this guy here. Remember, we're going to want the inverse of this pan, so if I start from the bottom up, it should be okay. So, I lift up the corners here, kind of force them against the pan a little bit, create a bit of a crimp. Has a chance to puff up again. All those little yeast clusters are burping and probably farting out carbon dioxide right now. And when the loaves hit the heat, all those pockets that are full of humid air are going to expand as those gases expand, and that's going to inflate our loaf. Okay, the long-awaited penultimate moment has finally come. It's time to bake these suckers. So we're going to get the wrap off them here, and I'm going to do a quick rundown of all the steps so far and all the steps that still remain. And don't worry, there really aren't many. So you see just how much these have risen. When this went in, it was maybe half this size. And that could be a problem later, actually. These might be over-risen or over-proofed, but time will tell. You will notice that sometimes the bread sticks to the parchment paper, like in this case. You can see this fold here. It's grabbed on there, but that's okay. Once it bakes, it will crack off, and you can peel the paper off relatively easily. So, first of all, before these go in, let's do a quick rundown, and there is one kind of fancy step left that we're going to do. So, let's run down the list here. First, we mixed our ingredients using a digital scale to weigh them first. Measure twice, cut once, check the details. Think about it before you do it. Then we do the first rise at room temperature or in a warm oven for 3 hours. Then we fold it over itself 10-ish times. You know, you saw me do it. Then we portion it into halves and shape it either into lengthwise loaf-like shapes or round bowls, or balls, as they say. Then we proof. That's what's been happening here. I believe this is bench proofing technically, when we're letting it rise one last time to get to develop small air bubbles that will become big air bubbles when it bakes. Then we preheat the oven and the baking vessels that we're using. That is the Dutch oven for this guy and the other baking pan for this guy at 450 Fahrenheit. Then what we're about to do is swap. So let's do the swap. Don't judge me. You don't know what time it is. Okay, these are hot. I'm going to do this guy first because it's a little more involved. Okay. Get this towel out of the way. Stand back from your oven when you open it, for the love of God. Okay, this gets tricky because this will have stuck a little bit to the pan. I'm going to start in this corner. Actually, I'm going to start in this corner back here because it's the wet one. Okay, so grab with a couple fingertips. Good. You come out of there. You go into there. You see it makes a little bit of a mess. Don't worry about it too much. Some of this is going to overhang. Just got to live with it. This one is not hot, so I can grab it. By the way, don't test if a pan is hot by touching it. You shouldn't have to tell anyone that, but I've done it. I did it last week. Okay, here we go. We got this. We're going to put our lid on, but before we do that, we're going to use what's called in the business a lame. Not a lame. It's not lame, it's awesome. It's a very artisanal step. It's a razor blade. And the fancy ones come with a little plastic handle that lets you kind of get in there a little tighter. But what this is going to do is it's going to expose some of the inner section of this dough, and when it rises, it's going to burst out through the holes that I make with the slash. So trying not to touch the exterior, I'm going to slash this kind of quickly here. Give it a super sharp. It's a brand new razor blade. Just came out of the box. Deft movements create cuts. So 3-ish slashes. That's going to create the pattern on top. Now using my lid, set this over. I'm using my oven mitts, crimp it on. And with any luck, once this hits the heat, it's going to climb the sides of the pan and become a beautiful traditional-ish loaf shape. So I'm going to put this one in, bring out my Dutch oven. And you go. Start the clock. Count up. Okay, this is ripping hot. So we're going to move quick. I don't want to waste any of this heat. Just as before, we grip in a few corners with our fingertips. We lift ever so gently. We lower down ever so gently. There we go. And with this one, I use my lame here, my blade. That's what it stands for. It's French for blade. I don't know if I actually said that. We're going to go with a very traditional X shape. That ought to do it. Lid on. Whew, that's hot enough to get right through my oven net. Okay. Move you over. In you go. Now those are going to stay in there for 30 minutes. And then we pull them out, take the lids off, take the parchment paper off, and let them have full exposure to the pan and the element from above to brown up and get a little extra color. And then we pull them when they're ready. They're going to be amazing. Just hang on, you're going to love this. We are about to remove the lid from our cooking vessels. We have scant few seconds remaining to steel our shaky nerves and get ready for action. Come on. Oh, baby, here we go. Oh, I'm excited. Stand back. Allow the immediate blast of heat to blow by you like a speeding car. Oh, dear God. That's hot. Even with the gloves on, that's hot. Okay. Prepare to be amazed. Lid number 1. Yes. Ah, the smell. It's intoxicating. Okay. That's a good sign. Now, this one, like I mentioned, cast iron, it retains a ton of heat. It has a very high heat capacity, whereas, and also more mass than this little bread pan or loaf pan that I've got here. Get the lid off this guy. Oh, that's too bad. My little slashes didn't really come through, but that's okay. So you see the top here where the slash was, you can see it looks a little bit wetter because it's opening up and fresh dough is being exposed to the heat as it opens up. And over here, the entire top of this loaf looks just kind of shiny. And those are, as I understand it, gelatinized starches. That's flour that's been in contact with water for long enough that the molecules have all fully hydrated and they form almost like a gel. And when you bake that gel, you get crispy, delicious awesomeness. So we need to get these out of their pan. Let's listen to it. It feels like almost like a water balloon with a crunchy shell. I would like that to have a little more color. So back into the pan it goes. Probably on the top, it's really, really pale. So I think it's going to go the full 15. Back in she goes, just like that. It's a good thing I don't have eyebrows anyway. Let's do a quick wrap up in these precious final seconds before action. Remember, measure twice, cut once. Do the math. Make sure that your recipe makes sense before you go out and execute. Follow your lists. Lists are your friend, as are timers and little measurement tricks like the one I showed you earlier. Just try stuff. Get more experienced with it. I like to set little timers for like 1 minute so that I can get used to feeling what a single minute feels like. And then when I'm cooking something, I know roughly how long it's been in the pan without even looking at a clock. Obviously, you let your senses guide you when you're frying something or when something's boiling, or like the butter in the Hutzla episode. You listen to your senses and they'll show you the way. I'm going to get this hot Dutch oven lid out of here, and we are ready for the big reveal. Okay. Red gods be kind. Not too bad. Oh yeah. See that? Lovely. Lovely browning. A lot more color on the loaf-shaped guy than we had before. This guy's even got a bit of an ear forming. That's what this is called when you get a spot that kind of curls up in a way and gets dark. It's called an ear. Some people think it's great. I think, personally, perfect sphere would be ideal here, but hey, what's math got to do with it? Let's have a look at the bottoms. Do bottoms up here. Oh yeah, we got a lot more color here than we did before. And the sound, it should sound roughly hollow. I guess when I flick it, it sounds pretty much solid, but when I tap it, it's a little, you can feel it. The bread inside, the still solidifying starches on the inside are, oh boy, everything's fine. So that came out quite nice. I have a tendency of going over on these things and browning them too much, but I think this came out pretty well. This corner is a little weird. I don't know what happened there. Actually, what happened there is the bread was not in contact with the pan, so it didn't get the full blast. I'm sure it's still lovely and crunchy though. Oh yeah. Okay, well, this has to hang out. So we're gonna get our cooling rack. Set that down. Yes. Okay, now let's see how Big Boy finished off here. Very similar look. You see that kind of uniform, but it's got the craggy edges from the parchment paper. Oh yeah, it's like a drum. Beautiful. It smells delicious. So that's going to hang out for a while. You do not cut in to a fresh loaf. No matter how much you want to, the smell will drive you insane. It's like the sirens calling to Odysseus. You don't want your ship to crash onto the rocks, you know? If this oven mitt is the ship and this oven mitt is the rocks where the sirens are calling, it's delicate. It needs to be given some room to learn who it is, to learn what it likes and what it doesn't like. You know, it's experimenting. All right, this analogy is tired. But long story short, you gotta let it rest. The crumb is setting up, it's solidifying. If you cut into it now, the soft inner bread is gonna tear away from the hard outer crust, and you're gonna have a mess. Even if you use a bread knife, the inside is relatively wet compared to the outside, and the crust on these things is one of the best parts. And it's quite robust. And so the effort it takes you to saw through the crust is probably enough to tear that soft bread on the inside away from it, and you'll ruin your slice. Just wait. Promise you, your patience will be rewarded. Patience is a virtue, blah, blah, blah. Let it sit, I would say 15 minutes. If you absolutely have to cut into it, wait 10. Like, really, you do have to let this rest for a second. All right, I'm belaboring the point, and there is whiskey to be had. The smell is driving me crazy, so I'm going to step away, and I'll show you the cross-section in 15 minutes. Deliverance is at hand, friends. We've been patient. We went through the steps. We screwed some of them up, and then we fixed them. And now, after all of our labor, we have 2 beautiful loaves of homemade bread. The house smells amazing, which would be great if it wasn't almost bedtime. We're going to cut into these things because not to do so would be a crime against bread everywhere. We have butter at the ready. We need that serrated bread knife from earlier and an appropriate cutting surface. My good cutting board is on another counter right now and I can't move it because it weighs a metric ton. So here we go. I'm just so excited. Okay, which one do we start with? I think the boule cross-section will be more impressive, so we're going to save him for last. We're going to cut up this guy. The end piece, obviously, with its high crust to interior ratio, is a coveted piece in the bread world, but for the sake of the internet, you got to do a cross-section dead center. So, as I mentioned before, you do not press right down with all the weight of the knife. You let the serrations do the job. Let the teeth chew and saw through. Do not press down more than like 10% pressure. Let the knife do the work. Here we go. Back and forth relatively quickly, keeping secure. Now the bottom crust is substantial on a loaf like this, so at this point, anchor. Now you can crush down and really drag the knife through the bottom. Okay, here we go. You ready? I'm ready. Oh yeah. You just can't beat it. It's a little bit squat, you know, we didn't get quite the lift I was expecting, but that would still make a respectable grilled cheese or sandwich, just a regular sandwich, you know, not even grilled. I'm very happy with that. And if you look at it, kind of play with it a little bit, touch it, the inside is still nice and moist, but the outside shell, especially the bottom, very sturdy. The top, not so much. That could have probably gone another 5 minutes or so, but hey, I'm going to toast this mostly later, and you don't really see all that much of this crust once you slice it one more time. So very happy with that. Now, let's see how she looks on the boule. I'm going to cut right through that beautiful ear. That's it. Nice and easy. You get close to the bottom, and you can press down and drag through. Wiggle a bit. Oh, yeah. Probably give us a little hinge. Here we go. Oh yeah. That's the ticket. You got a nice mix of big voids, mostly small, nice and consistent throughout, so you don't have any giant chasms that your butter is going to fall through or whatever you do. Like, you can make a grilled cheese with this because the cheese isn't going to fall through any big hole in the surface. Just great. You have to make this. You have to. It's the best bread ever. And you made it yourself. It's amazing. You're like, what did it take? A few hours? And most of that you spent on the couch. So do it. Just do it. Put that back together. Now, a loaf like this, you can pretty much just store it, cut end down on a cutting board like that for a few days. And all right, listen to this. Oh man, don't even get me started. Bottom crust, beautiful crunch, but the bread is chewy and tender throughout. Oh, it's so good. All right, I am a glutton for sodium. Can't help myself. That's salted butter too. Oh man. Yeah. This video's over. I need to go be alone. Make bread. You won't regret it. See ya.